Good afternoon and welcome to our live CIPR TV show on Wednesday the 13th of July, brought to you by the CIPR social media panel and marketeers for DC. My name's Stephen Waddington and I'm joined in the studio today by Gemma Griffiths.
Hi.
Today we're going to be talking about the future of the media. We're going to take a look at the implications for the public relations industry.
Last week we witnessed Media History as Britain's biggest selling newspaper, The News of the World, closed. The last ever edition of the 168-year-old paper went on sale on Sunday. The ongoing issues in the media have been raised at the highest level within government over the last week. Within the last few hours, News International has withdrawn its bid for B-Sky B, and the Prime Minister David Cameron has announced a public inquiry led by Lord Justice Leveson. The judge will have the powers to question media owners, editors and politicians under oath.
The media scandal has rekindled the debate about the future of the media regulation, journalism ethics and eroding standards. We've had a last-minute change of guests in the studio today after the Media Standards Trust's Martin Moore has been delayed in ongoing discussions at Downing Street. But we're delighted to be joined by Brian Cathcart, Professor of Journalism at Kingston University, and Claire Wardle, a former academic that trains journalists on the use of social media.
Welcome to you both and thanks for joining us. So if you have a question to put to our guests, either submit it via the question box or tweet using the hashtag CIPRtv. We'll try our very best to include your question within the show and get to the questions. So Claire, let's kick off with you. What's your thoughts on the phone hacking scandal and the events over the last couple of weeks?
It's absolutely unbelievable. I mean, you couldn't have dreamed this would have happened. And on a personal level, somebody called this journo nerd crack. And I find myself I cannot believe, I can't remember the last story that was like this. But as somebody who's interested in press and power and democracy, it's completely earth-shattering. I mean, maybe we'll reflect in a couple of months and maybe things won't have turned out how we're currently thinking. But when you think of the events and think of the implications, it's hard to reflect now when we're right in the middle of it. But I think it's great to have this conversation, but I think we can't really perceive what will happen tomorrow, let alone in 2 months or 6 months' time.
Brian, can I ask you about the response from News International? First of all, it closed the News of the World. Today we've heard it's withdrawn its bid for B-Sky B. What's the future for this for News International as a news organisation?
It's very hard to say. I mean, I've been wondering for the past 10 days or so whether there's anybody has their hands on the tiller, as it were. It seems to be adrift. And the decision to close the News of the World, which I regard as a piece of vandalism, was taken, apparently to save them from having to sack Rebekah Brooks. Well, how mad is that? I just wonder whether they're thinking rationally under all this pressure, which is ironic given that they're usually the people who dish out the pressure.
Let's talk a little bit about media regulation. So David Cameron has said time and time again that the PCC has failed in its role, and he called today for independent regulation rather than self-regulation of the media. What's your thoughts on that, Brian? Well,
I think your starting point is that the present system doesn't work. I mean, the Press Complaints Commission is actually what it says on the tin. It's a complaints body. It isn't anything more, unfortunately. And I think the idea was that if you handled complaints efficiently, it would trickle up through the system and affect all the other journalists, and they would somehow feel themselves accountable to the complaints process. But it doesn't work that way. You can see that editors working down look at a given situation and they say, is this going to get me in trouble with the PCC? Is the alternative having nothing on my front page? Damn it, I'm going with it, And that's the way it's played. So you have to accept that it hasn't worked, and that something else will have to come along. Now, there are going to be long and bitter arguments about what else it should be. But I think the starting point that this little system as it is doesn't work is established.
Claire, continue on that theme. There's been a lot of debate about whether this was a story that was blown up by social media. I think the journalists at The Guardian will probably have a big an answer to that, but has social media succeeded where ethics have failed, do you think?
It's a good question. I don't think it's succeeded. It's very easy to look at it in isolation, but I think what happened was the Millie Dowler story took what had been around for 2 years and had been bubbling under the surface and took that outside the kind of the journalism circles. And I think everybody would say you go everywhere, whether it's a taxi or a bank or a shop, and everybody is talking about it. And ultimately, social media has played a part in that because more people are sharing and discussing things in a way that, yes, they were doing it individually in their bedrooms. Now we see it, you know, out for everybody to see. So I think it definitely amplified it in the way that you've seen social media amplifying a number of different stories, but it wasn't social media what won it, I don't think.
What about standards in journalism? Have they dropped over the past decade, or is this just a small number of journalists that are being unethical and all other reporters being tarred with the same brush?
Do you want to answer?
Well, I think, first of all, the point you know, we've all got to accept that this is a story, a sensational story that has been broken by absolutely outstanding journalism, most of it at The Guardian. Absolutely outstanding journalism. So there is really, really good journalism out there. Have standards fallen? That's one of those sort of unanswerable questions. How do you measure, you know, standards today against standards 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 40 years ago? I think what we could probably agree on is that standards no longer match whatever they were in the past. They do not now match public expectations. And I think there's a whole sort of cultural change has taken place. If you look at the railways or the police or any other sort of public service, it has to be accountable. We look to them and we say, if you're making a mess, we want to see that you're cleaning it up, that you're behaving appropriately to the victims, that you are making sure that your systems are being changed and that the people responsible are held accountable. And all of those things we demand, partly because the press demands it, of, you know, Parliament, of all sorts of public institutions. The funny thing is the press never asked it of itself. And we've reached that point now. And I think that's the big sort of cultural change. It's not so much about falling standards as rising expectations.
If I can just come in and say, I think now because of social media, there's an expectation that transparency is is the bottom line. And so actually now I think when we're looking to see what might replace the PCC, now there's an expectation that because of the web and because of, you know, transparency and data, we should be able to have those sorts of things. And Cameron today was talking about, you know, all conversations being recorded, you know, those sorts of things. That's partly because we're now living in a slightly different era where we are used to lots of institutions being held accountable.
There's been a question, I mean, events have caught up with us today, but there's been a question over the last week of whether the media has led, the media or the public has led the government along. I mean, governments finally seem to catch up with the issue. Brian, you've been right at the heart of government in advising on this issue. Has the government finally caught up with the public's expectation of them? Yeah,
I mean, I wouldn't want to criticise on my experience of the past 3 days of meeting the three party leaders. I think that they've all risen to this challenge as well as anybody could hope, really. I've been most impressed by the way they wanted to listen, and they were switched on to the idea that politicians are in the frame here and need to be accountable. You saw that in the House of Commons, MPs across the chamber agreeing that they too had let the public down. It wasn't just the press, it wasn't just the police. And I think, you know, you have to give them credit. Whether they're catching up with the public, maybe they are, maybe they've been pushed into it. But I think to some extent, and this is just an impression of my own, I think there's some sense of relief in politics that they may have a chance of getting this beast off their back.
Just to talk a little bit about the newsroom and how it's going to change that, there was a question on Twitter this morning from Katie Askew from Racepoint, and she said, her question was, how is this going to change the newsroom and the relationship between editors and reporters? A PR is going to see a notable difference, for instance.
I think there has been a change within the way that newsrooms are finding stories, and social media is part of that. There has been a big talk, and there was a debate last week about journalism, you know, the fact that more and more news stories are coming from press releases. But I think what's interesting is actually now people are seeing the process. And somebody made an analogy of you might like a sausage, but you don't actually want to see the way that a sausage is being made. And I think partly in the last couple of weeks, people have had their eyes opened to some of these things to do with collusion, you know, much more serious than just, oh, is this based on a press release? So actually, I think that what the public are going to start saying is we want to be more aware of those. So if that means that relationships between editors, their reporters, PRs, those sorts of things, I think that can only be a good thing. But I think we'll have to wait and see whether this will be a sea change or whether, you know, this is just a couple of weeks sea storm.
I think, I mean, Claire, like me, teaches young journalists, sends them, as it were, out into the workplace. And I've been worried for a long time, and you know, you hear remarks from the students too, that we try and teach them to be good journalists, ethical journalists, responsible journalists, people who think about the implications of what they do. And then there's a sort of thought in their mind that maybe the minute they leave university and go into the workplace, there's a whole different set of rules, and that actually you just park all that stuff and you enter into this snake pit. And you know, I don't think that's right, and I don't think it, you know, I don't think it's sustainable. And I think what we're seeing now is the unsustainability of it. So in terms of the way newsrooms change, I mean, you know, all newsrooms aren't snake pits, but I think the process by which some of the ethical decisions are taken inside newsrooms is going to have to develop. And journalists are going to have to think in the way that other people with ethical responsibilities have to think about the consequences of what they do.
We're more than halfway through. If you have a question, please do tweet it using the hashtag CIPRtv. One question I want to come on to now is the role of journalism. It appears to me so often when we discuss the future of journalism, and the future of the publishing of journalism is interchanged and confused. How much do you think the pressure on the newsroom, on publications, is impacting the output of journalism and what the content that they're producing? Claire, from a social media point of view, we're seeing how social media is impacting newsrooms day in, day out. Yeah,
but I think we also have to really look at resources and the economics of news, because I think we can get caught up in, is this lazy journalism, you know, is it, you know, our PRs taking away? But actually it's the fact that newsrooms are being squashed desperately, and there is more and more competition to get more and more stories out there, and so journalists are having to do what they have to do to get, you know, websites are updated every 3 minutes, some of those big websites. It's becoming a sausage factory. So I think we have to look at that. But, you know, in terms of newsrooms, for example, using social media to get stories, well, some people say to me, well, how can you train journalists to do that? They should be in the pub. Well, actually, previously, you know, in the last 7 years, journalists have been tied to their desk, you know, just having to get the stories out. Well, now this means that they can access different types of people, different types of stories, and actually widen that. So social media isn't the answer to news woes, but in some ways it's helping get a broader type of story. But resources and economics are huge in this context.
Yes, I think, I mean, you can't afford to live in a dream world where, you know, we can afford luxury journalism, you know, in every outlet. I think, you know, these are tough times, and the whole industry is being squeezed, and this is going to increase costs. There's no two ways about it.
And do you think the fact that the industry is being squeezed has resulted in the situation we are today, or is it a separation?
Well, I have to say, I think that trying to find some sort of economic explanation for somebody hacking into the mobile phone of an abducted and, as it transpired, murdered schoolgirl, I don't think we can add those two things together. This is just a collapse of morality. But I do think newspapers have always been high-pressure environments, but I think it's got more difficult. It's got very stressful in the sense of economic insecurity all around you when you're a journalist. And I think, you know, there are great difficulties adapting.
We had a question earlier on in the week from David Phillips. I'm just going to read it out here. He makes the point that there's no longer anywhere to hide on the web, and who, after the events of last week, is going to be brave enough to face the real issue of standards for both journalists and PR in a transparent world?
Who's going to be brave enough
to face the real issue of standards for both journalists and PRs in a transparent world?
Well, I would say that one of the answers to that is that this public inquiry, this two-phase public inquiry, is going to have to face some of those issues. It's about the ethics and standards of journalism, and you know that's part of what's mentioned there. I think people underestimate, I think, probably the degree to which many journalists are concerned about these issues, talk about these issues all the time, and you know, care about ethics and standards and worry about the future. So you know, this is not the first time for many journalists that they've confronted these issues. It's just that it's the first time for a lot of members of the public.
David Cameron said today, he was talking about there has been too much media courting, and that will have to stop in the future. He did also say that we're not all going to become monks and stop having relationships with journalists. But what is your opinion of the relationships at a senior level between media owners and people like Rebecca Brooks, for instance?
I think this is partly, again, people didn't understand the extent of what was actually happening. And again, I think this has moved out beyond just journalism circles to the wider public, saying, what, he had a party 3 weeks ago and all the leaders were there. So I think in terms of transparency, those things will now have to be public, and there'll be public records, and people expect to know who's met with whom, and it'll have to come out in the open. And I think the public will have more of an appetite for that. And that might itself be driving sales. Who knows? It might be, if that's the norm, then everybody will have to lift their standards because the public is demanding it. That's what I hope anyway.
Quick shout out to Shireen Q and Alex Fenty on Twitter. Thanks for your comments, guys. If we can move on and talk about what the future might look like. I know it's difficult when events are moving so quickly, but the broadcast industry has a model for regulation. There you have a license, and if you break the terms of your license, it's withdrawn. Might we see that in the publishing industry?
It's hard to see this country, which has such long traditions of sort of free, unlicensed publication. It's hard to see it going that direction. You know, who knows what will develop in the debates and discussions over the next couple of years that we see with this inquiry. But I think less likely than licensing is some sort of statutory backstop, for example. I'm not advocating this, I'm just thinking what might be likely, where for most purposes the press regulates itself, but where there is a flagrant and persistent problem, that might be passed on to Ofcom or whatever. Is
there a model anywhere else in the world that we can look to and learn from?
Well, there's the Advertising Standards Authority in this country has, I mean, I don't want to say it's a model, but it has something similar to that as a backstop arrangement, so that when something really goes off the rails, actual regulation can be enforced.
Okay. Just to talk a second about what this scandal and the events of the last couple of weeks means for the PR profession. So we've had a question in from Nick Akolkana on Twitter asking, how can PRs help decrease and avoid journalism? Should the responsibility be with the PRs, or does it actually lie with the journalists? Claire, to you first.
Well, this debate last week was actually really interesting because it was PRs and journalists in a room who first of all said, I hate you, I hate you. Oh, let's just chat about it. And that was actually, it was a really great event. So I think in terms of what might happen, one of the arguments is that many people in PR now are actually ex-journalists. So they are writing fabulous press releases, which make it very easy for journalists just to copy and paste. And we feel very upset about that. But then there's a sense of, why would you rewrite something that's really good? There was also the really good argument, which is previously a lot of things happened on the phone. Now that happens as part of a press release. So there was this idea, well, it's more transparent. So I don't really know. But I do think there is an element on the part of the journalist to think about is just copy and pasting the answer. The other thing I'd say is when you look at the ecosystem now in terms of social media, people are sharing what's really good. So if it's a very flat story of who, what, why, you know, or where, I'm not going to share that with my friends on Facebook or Twitter because it's very flat. I will share something that's in-depth, thoughtful, has a data visualization, has a bit of rich content. I want those added extras. So I think journalists are going to have to start from taking the bare bones from a press release and then making it better, because that's the only way people are going to share it. So, but we'll see whether that happens.
Which is an opportunity for public relations people to provide.
That's true. Well. Yes, that's true.
So we've had a question linked to this, Claire, from Claire Wardle, who said you've trained BBC journalists to use social media. Is the social web, do you think, an answer to transparency? And perhaps, you know, how is it already impacting the work that journalists do?
Absolutely. There's this phrase, transparency is the new objectivity, which is this idea, actually, you get one side then the other side, and that's the objective truth. That doesn't exist. And actually, journalists have to be very transparent around their own belief systems, what they've done previously. You know, if you're a new journalist and you've spent 5 years at university and you've got Facebook pages declaring your political interests, that's a very different world if you then become, you know, you work for the politics section of the BBC. So we're going to see changes in that way. So, yeah, I think it can help because people have an expectation that now you can link out to your research, you can explain how you've made your document. So I think it is part of the process.
So we just had a question it's for both of you, and it's from Jane Wilson from the CIPR. Can we finally now put to bed the tired old view that journalists are ethical and PRs aren't? Surely we have to agree that there are shades of grey in each profession. Brian, to you first.
I mean, you know, call me a victim. I always think that people think journalists aren't ethical. So, you know, I'm more concentrating, I suppose, on improving the image of journalists than I am worried about the image of PRs. I have nothing against PRs.
I think there is a trust thing when you look now at the public who they're not trusting journalists, they're not trusting PRs, and they're not trusting the process, and that's very, very sad. You know, I can talk about journo nerd crack, but actually we're looking at a couple of weeks that actually have really unsettled some really important structures, and I hope that we come out of this in a better place.
So maybe this is a good point to end. 2 weeks ago, who could have predicted that we'd be here now having this discussion? Can you leave us with a point for your vision for what the media might look like in the UK in 12 months' time as a result of this scandal? What's the biggest lesson we're going to take?
I think it's inevitable that there will be some caution in the next 6 months or a year.
So no big stories broken.
Of a sort that you're not used to. Some restraint and some reflection. I think that's inevitable. I mean, I'm not saying that there won't be any great stories, but I think that people will want to think, particularly in the tabloid press, about what they're prepared to publish. And that's not because they're being threatened by the government or threatened by anybody else, except by their own reading public.
Yeah, I think the same thing. People are going to expect, and through social media will be able to see, and you know, they will be correcting stories that are wrong. You're already seeing that happening on social media. So I think it will be better, but I think it will be more cautious. But I do hope that we don't take any knee-jerk reactions to all of this. And I think, you know, the closure of the News of the World happened very quickly. The last 2 weeks have been very shocking. I think it is time for reflection, and hopefully the inquiries will do that.
Thank you both. I'm afraid we're out of time. We could go on and continue this discussion for hours. Thanks to our guests, Brian and Claire, for joining us today. Thanks to the team at Marketeers 4DC for making this show happen. I realise a lot of people tweeted during the show. If we didn't get to your question, I'm sorry. With the help of our guests, we'll hope to answer as many questions via Twitter over the coming hours. Thanks again for watching today, and until the next time, goodbye.